All right, for the second lecture of the 5 subsection 2, we're going to talk a bit about dynamic difficulty and the concept of an AI director, and compared to the previous Bayes statistics lecture, that's going to be quite quick, so bear with me. But long story short, right, games have a lot of parallelism, we've got a lot of physics, SIMD, graphics gets offloaded to the GPU, so how do we design a parallel system for AI, right? Read a lot about this. We talked about this last week in the Alex. I can never pronounce his last name. But and we're not going to do the 6 to 8 minute breakout groups. But I recommend that you pause here and kind of think a little bit about how would you design a system for this. So parallelism is important, right? This may be a little bit dated at this point, this slide, right? But every single day, things just get faster, GPUs get bigger, right? In fact, I'm staring down a 3090 machine with 64 core Threadripper thing here that I use for machine learning, things are only going more parallel and more distributed and bigger all these numbers are just getting bigger and bigger. This machine, for example, already has 256 gigabytes of RAM. So things are changing a lot. The way games are changing quite substantially too, as a result of increased access to hardware. For example, nowadays dedicated CUDA cores and actual ML tensor cores and things like that, which are indeed, talking a little bit about this, like what should the AI run on? Well, if you have an iPhone, you have a dedicated tensor core in the CPU that's on your phone, and for the most part that's likely just sitting dormant if you're playing a game on your phone. And then the phones of today are, let's say, more powerful than the Xboxes of yesterday, and that trend is going to only continue versus an increase in trajectory versus slow down. So something to think a little bit about when you think about the AI systems, like, all right, one player's AI, which is fun, is another player's nightmare, right? People are approaching this. You have a very wide breadth of audience. Some people want a lot of challenge. Some people want not so much. And so how do you vary the game to make that more enjoyable? So you have this idea of what's called dynamic difficulty adjustment, and how does that work? And also what's called AI directors, or ways, like kind of overarching systems that, watch the different aspects and different subsystems of your game and make sure that the user is getting the right kind of experience, given perhaps the choice of difficulty that they chose, or in some cases even dynamically adapting to the play style of the game. There's actually a really cool, I think, recently notable example of this. If any of you all have played Fortnite, when you first play Fortnite and you log into a game, the Fortnite actually doesn't let you play against experienced players yet. They will your first few sessions will be with some mix of beginner players like you, and then some mix of actually AI bots that are relatively weak. They're not very smart bots, and they just sort of stand there and wait for you to shoot them. And the reason that Fortnite does this is to give new users a very good experience of playing the game, right? Because if any of you have played Fortnite for a long time, there are people out there that are, in this sort of upper echelon of gameplay. And if you're just playing the game for the first time, bump into that, you may never come back. And as Fortnite as a game, right? Think about Epic as a company. They don't really care as much about, people having the most perfect game, like purist kind of thing. They care about people coming back to their game so they can make more money, right? So these techniques are actually quite useful, especially as you enter into an era of gaming which is going to be mobile heavy, multiplayer basically expected, if not designed for multiplayer, and also with a sort of diverse set of mastery skills that require many hours of play before you really understand what the hell you're doing in the game. So yeah, just a really cool example of this in practice today. So dynamic difficulty adjustment and the AI director system, it really means we're collecting data about the player, right? We talked about Bayes in this last lecture. You can imagine, fitting some kind of, system to predict the difficulty of a given player based on data points, like how many times are they dying, and maybe you reduce the difficulty every time you do it. Just use a relatively simple frequency counting system to kind of figure that out, or you let them choose their difficulty, right? Like in Halo, you choose legendary versus noob or whatever it might be, and that goes back to even the early versions of Wolfenstein and Doom, right? That let you have the choice of difficulty. But also, we've got the system of what's called the AI director, and this can sort of work in unison with the difficulty adjustment system or the choice that the user has made to ensure that all of the the underlying AI systems that are being used sort of adhere to these requirements. And so you can kind of expect certain architectural decisions and technology decisions to be based on how do we propagate a difficulty into the game, right? So if you're playing making a first-person shooter, right, perhaps difficulty results in the number of enemies, or how quickly the enemies can aim, or what's the accuracy and things like that. If you're making a real-time strategy game, perhaps the difficulty has to do with the speed at which the enemy can respond to your actions, and like how many actions per minute or whatever it might be. So there are a very diverse set of ways to approach difficulty in a game, and it's going to be very specific to the genre and the game and even the user. So this is something that you should spend some time thinking about when you're building out. So some challenges, right? Some players hate it, right? Like I mentioned the Fortnite example, and many of you that play Fortnite may not even know about that. And you might say, oh, that's not fair. But so what, right? Like, not your game, right? So ultimately the intent of these systems is designed not necessarily for the end user enjoyment of the game, but rather retention and quality of experience, which they sound like they should be the same thing, but they're not the same thing, especially with multiplayer games, right? Because the worst experience a multiplayer game user can have is go to play the game and there's nobody there to play it with them. And that's a really bad experience. So dynamic difficulty adjustment doesn't work for all situations. Certain games are just static, like a puzzle, for example, or a maze, or things like that, like point and click puzzle solvers and things like that. Also, if you've played Halo, for example, I had a friend who drove me crazy. He would play Halo on the easiest difficulty setting. He'd basically take a beer, just smash playing Halo, where he would just run into the middle of the room and get shot at, and nothing would happen because it's low difficulty. You don't get damage, and you just just play it like a music video essentially. Like, didn't really, you might as well be watching Twitch at that point. And so to me, I was like, oh my god, like this is the work, because I like to play Halo on Legendary. I like to really savor this well put together single player narrative. It's very rare to find anymore, and so it's complicated. So there's a paper on this game, Facade, which is really cool. It came out a while ago, and it was all about dialogue and things like that. And it's really cool because it sort of talks about speech recognition and narrative, and it's one of the it's not the first one, but it's one of the early ones, and it's been kind of a notable example of that. And it kind of depends on this concept of what's called beats, or a unit of dramatic action, and these are comprised of joint dialogue behavior. So when you kind of choose a bit of dialogue and there's a response to that, and there's an overall kind of goal, and there are sub goals mixed in, handlers for the reordering or moving of different beat goals and so on, and these things kind of get mixed together, and you get this like emergent experience. And this is very, if we've talked about strips and GOAP before, and so a lot of this seems very similar, but you can kind of imagine that the pacing of these things, how do you make sure that the pacing happens correctly? And this is sort of an example of what an AI director would do to ensure that these beats happen in the correct fashion and are orchestrated in a good way as well. L4D is another example of a good AI director. And please check out this video at your own time of the page. So that's really it for this lecture. It's kind of a very quick, light one. just really think about the real takeaway here. Just really think about the fact that when you're integrating these systems into your games, often you're going to have to think about difficulty, the end user experience. On top of that, the orchestration and the way all these systems sort of communicate and intertwine with the underlying systems, both in terms of compute and the parallelism, but also in terms of the orchestration, for example, with SOD, as well as you know, how you know the AI interacts with dynamics of the game that you're intending to build. So a little bit lofty. That's about it for this week.